Okay, welcome all to Holy Trinity Church. We want to thank Reverend Jack for having us here to present for the second time the history of the Lake End Corporation. This history is quite unique, and it was only because Hope, and Lawrence wrote a research book on the history of Green Pond that allowed us to see those earliest of years. We have slides tonight that are early years, but we have many pictures from the later years. So for those of you that were unable to make it in June when we were actually at the Lake End Hotel, we welcome you back again. We will be filming this for posterity because we feel the information is that important. Again, we thank Hope, and Lawrence for publishing the book that really allowed most of the early years research that we have here. I would like to ask the Lake End Corporation Executive Board members to please stand up. I know you're here. We have Bruce Haas. We have John. We have Tom Cochran. And thank you for your service. If you have ever worked on a board, you have no clue otherwise how much time they put in. And they're basically doing the same thing that the board did 100 years ago. So we have to start back at the beginning, and that would be with the Indians, the Lenape Indians. They were pretty much the first documented inhabitants through Green Pond. Shown on this map in 1933, there was a 70-mile Indian trail that went from Greenwood Lake all the way down to Perth Amboy. That went right through Green Pond. That is known as the eventual Lake End Trail, and it is up on this map, and you'll see it as a little dot between the P and the E in the word Copperas Mountain. We're going to talk more about that trail later. So the Indians, you know, they moved from place to place. Any Indian went where anybody wanted to go, and they had no understanding of the term land ownership, titling, or deed. That was a foreign concept. Nobody owns land. It's free. It's for everyone to use. Well, the land is free for us to share unless you were the British. That's not the way the British saw it. When they came in, and when I tell you I'm greatly simplifying, we could probably do about 10 hours on about 4 slides, so we're going to really pare it down. To simplify things, the King of England claimed the New World from the Dutch. There were some wars in between. The French, the Swedes, King Louis XIV got in there. We had the Norwegians come in. We got to make sure we give them some credit. And eventually, though, the king claimed from Cape Cod to Virginia, pretty much a large chunk of the eastern seaboard. The first thing that the king did was gave New Caesarea, did I say that right? New Caesarea, thank you, later called New Jersey, to his brother, the good old Duke of York. If it didn't have that song, who would know who he was? He turned around and promptly gave New Jersey to 2 of his big supporters, Vice Admiral Sir George Carteret, that's where that came from, and to Sir John Lord Berkeley. So now what does this mean? 2 people own the entire state of New Jersey. Well, with that ownership comes the right to govern, police, collect rent and taxes, or say, that's my property, because they could own any pieces that they wanted. But they had no way to get income. So what they did was they brought in 12 investors. Those investors paid a lot of money to Berkeley and Carteret. So now they collectively own all of New Jersey, and they brought in 12 more. So we have 24 people who own the state of New Jersey. This will really make sense in a few minutes. And they were called proprietors. These proprietors had rights to land ownership for 314 years, beginning back in, I believe, let me go back one slide, 1600s, late 1600s. So once the proprietors, who probably took out mortgages and loans, paid into this proprietary, let's just call it a circle, that became a corporation. And that corporation now has those same rights to govern, to tax, to sell, or to claim land that they want. So if one of the proprietors decided to go out and do a survey of a little grassy field that nobody thought had any value, they could claim that grassy field as their own. That grassy field today is Morristown. And they didn't have to pay any additional money. They had already bought into the corporation. They also could do the surveying and sell that property to you. So once they surveyed Morristown, rather than take it for themselves, they could sell it to you. They would put that money in that proprietor corporation. And it was that survey that gave true title and land ownership. If you go back in the New Jersey records, you will find almost every single deed in the state of New Jersey goes back to those proprietors, the original 24 owners of New Jersey. And those proprietors, they did go out. Just check with Andrew Lemuel Cobb. He and his son, Andrew Bell Cobb, went out and found places that they thought that nobody else thought they wanted, but they knew would be valuable. One of those places was the northern end of Green Pond. The other place was Kittatinny, and the other place was Split Rock. So when they died, their children then became those owners. This is not Lake End Corporation. So that was the depth of these proprietors. Once they surveyed it and claimed it for themselves, they just passed it through the family until the family decided to sell. So when they surveyed, they not only obtained the land, but the land under the lake. In many other states, the state owns the lake and the land under and the water, but not in New Jersey. New Jersey missed the boat on that one, shockingly. So the reason that Lemuel Cobb did not get all of Green Pond is because two of his proprietor friends beat him to it. Cortlandt Skinner and John Johnson surveyed 4,600 acres of Lake Denmark area. And I can just imagine on a napkin, they said, you know what? We want Lake Denmark, which I don't know what that was called at the time, and we want all of this. So on a napkin, they drew like a square, and when they drew that square, South Green Pond was a part of that survey tract. And that is how Lake End separated from Green Pond Corporation, which were not in existence at that time. But they didn't really want South Green Pond. They were interested in something else. Why did Skinner and Johnson want the Denmark property? Anyone have a guess? The mines. They were going after the forges. They wanted to have possession of the iron mining forges that were extremely valuable, and the proprietors claimed it for themselves. If you look at this picture, you will see how many forges were in the Lake Denmark area. And the little blue dot there, that would be Lake Denmark, so that gives you an understanding of the size of this property. Now, this 1779 British map of the Revolutionary War is not by any means to scale. Those are my lines. They are not to scale. Particularly if you look at the length of Green Pond, that is absolutely inaccurate. But they wanted those forges, and the south of Green Pond just happened to be in there. And from that point on, 100 years later, we see on the 1899 map that the Denmark line is still the accepted line of land title. So Cortlandt Skinner came in, did that survey, split the lake, and years later, Lemuel Cobb came in and surveyed the other end of the lake, So we have two different owners that then passed down through the years. So the little blue X on this slide shows you the beginning. That would be number 101 Lake End Road, and everything south of that. And then on the other side of the line would be the Green Pond Corporation for Lemuel Cobb years later. Also, I want to mention that this was called Green Lake at the time. And we see a lot of that Green Lake terminology even in the Green Lake train station, which we'll see a little bit later on. This is a more modern look of the Lake Denmark line, or the Denmark line, again, not to scale. But this is the 1933 Green Pond map showing the separation of land ownership from those proprietors. So we have 4,600 acres of property. Over the years, the parcels are split. People start selling off pieces and parts. And the ones that we're interested in include the US government, who turned it into Picatinny Arsenal, Mr. Ford, as in the Ford Faish House. But one of the ones that we're interested in here is Ernest Fielder, 1859. Ernest Fielder came in and he leased to Mr. Edwin Merritt some property. Mr. Merritt in the 1870s built the Merritt Park Hotel #1. That foundation still exists, and that's where we're going to go for a hike. That is in the Picatinny Arsenal area. Prior to Merritt coming in, none of that was developed. But remember, if the proprietors gave you property and you built on it, now you had to pay taxes into the corporation of the proprietor corporation, which today is probably like the New Jersey government. I don't think it's much different. So Mr. Merritt builds his Park Hotel, and about 10 years later, he finally purchases the land from Mr. Fielder, and he also purchases additional property to total 1,300 acres, and that went all the way up to Green Pond. So now Merritt owns somewhat south of Lake Denmark through what we would know as the outlet and up to the Denmark line, all owned by Mr. Merritt. Sadly, Mr. Merritt's first hotel burned down in 1892. They all burned down back then. They were all using kerosene and fireplaces, and everything burned down. So he decided to rebuild his home, and his hotel, and that is what this slide is showing you. This is the second Merritt Hotel, and we have documentation that it was both the Lake Denmark Hotel or the Lakeside Hotel. Of great interest to Green Pond are the red arrows. Those are railroad tracks that eventually become the Wharton and Northern Line, which is how folks from Paterson or Dover would arrive to Green Pond. They would take that train, and that train went right in front of that hotel. Now, if any of you are familiar with the Green Pond Hotel, doesn't it have some similar characteristics? So I guess that's just the way they built hotels back then. So this particular photo is circa about 1905. There is a similar one on the first Wharton and Northern train schedule, which also has our first documented Green Pond Hotel photo as well. This also burned down, and the blue arrow on the slide is showing you the corner of the barn foundation that still exists today. That is on Picatinny property. It is federal property. We've been known to go out and kind of like look around places maybe we shouldn't be. That's not one I recommend you go out looking for. So what Mr. Merritt did with his ownership is he built a road, and that road started right there at the Merritt Second Hotel. And that road went just slightly south of Lake Denmark and then came through right up to Green Pond. And that was access to the lake, what is now the Lake End Corporation. That road is only 4 miles long, and you reached paradise. He advertised the greatest fishing, the greatest pickerel that you could possibly have. And some refer to this as the rhodie path or the rhododendron path. Now, to give you a reference from the other side, I drive down Lake End Road. I have two choices. I drive into the woods or I make a right-hand turn. If I go straight into the woods, that would be the end of that Denmark Road. And I can take that, in theory. I will hit a fence that's now Picatinny Arsenal and then go through that fence, if I was crazy, and I could walk down whatever's left of that road, nature's really overtaken it, and get back down to that original Merritt Hotel. Is that understanding to everybody? That that's how they got there. Lake End Road wasn't there. They could canoe from the Green Pond end, but I don't know if you've been canoeing lately. That's an awful long way in a canoe. The road by 1928 was impassable, and this map, where the blue arrows are, show the road, how it just slightly goes underneath Lake Denmark and then comes up. The black line going horizontally would be, not to scale, the fence of Picatinny Arsenal, and now we cross that fence and we are now on Lake End Corporation property. The very far to the left picture is actually a blow-up of what those blue arrows are pointing to, and it says impassable road. And this was one of the most wondrous beauty of a road that you could take. It was easy now for folks to go from Dover up into Lake Denmark and then continue on the road up to Green Pond. It was described as winding through a natural gorge bordered with rocky palisades of wondrous beauty, some of the wildest and most picturesque scenery in New Jersey. It was described as 5 miles to get there and 4 miles back, because we all know the mountain you have to climb to get up into Green Pond. And if you see these pictures, it's just stunning. The waterfall is a more modern picture. The middle one is a postcard that we found. And in an interview in 1880, Green Pond resident Joseph Tuttle recalled this as a major road from Lake Denmark. And now, simply 30 years later, the road is impassable, and that's because Merritt was tired of continually throwing money into that road. It had become a carriage road, so as the more modern times came, they could get on a little horse and buggy and carriage their way up to the south end of Green Pond. If you decide to walk this from the Green Pond side and you take Lake End Road and go straight, you better have good muddy boots, because since the beavers came, the water has risen. It's quite muddy and mucky. And basically, eventually, you're going to hit that fence that then puts you onto Picatinny Arsenal property. Our research team found several newspaper articles that included Green Pond, how beautiful it was, how you could come and fish here. It was in the Newark Daily Advertiser, another article around Green Pond. And if anyone ever wants to see any of these, you're more than welcome to that information. In 1887, it made the news that the hotel known as Lake Denmark will be open to the public, and hacks will run from Lake Denmark up to Green Pond. They had other news. Merritt was going to build a ranch at the south end of Green Pond. I don't know what a ranch meant in the 1800s, but it was a ranch mostly for fishermen, and we believe that ranch is the root of the Lake End Hotel. That's what started that hotel, was Mr. Merritt. So by the late 1800s, you could come up by hack or hike. You could canoe, rowboat. At this point, there still were no trains and there were no cars. It is also documented a few years later that Mr. Merritt opened now a satellite hotel, kind of moved up from the ranch. In Green Pond, that would be your Lake End Hotel. John Staff and Tom Morphy were managers. We believe that Morphy had some type of a financial investment in the hotel, but it was still called a small hotel and a fishing ranch. We believe that it was at the location of the current Lake End Hotel, although we cannot confirm any other documentation of that. But the descriptions in some of these it was called the Iron Era newspapers, do confirm that's pretty much where it was. The accommodations were described as homey, comfortable atmosphere. Guests could swim and boat and fish, hike, or play tennis. I'm not sure back then where they were playing tennis. We don't have any documentation on that. Tennis court was not there this early. It was a favorite resort, entrancingly beautiful body of water, several chestnut trees, which we know are no longer there. Now, we didn't have TripAdvisor to go back and tell us what a beautiful place it was or wasn't, but it's kind of like what Green Pond Lake End Corporation still is today. It's a wonderful place to be. In our earliest known subdivision map, Mr. Merritt starts ordering surveys. He's not dumb. He's going to survey this out and sell this property so that he can make some money. Up until now, they've allowed free camping. So you would come up by hack or walk, and you could camp. And he started complaining that the campers did nothing but complain that the road was bumpy and leave garbage. So he was getting annoyed with them. And so he began to no longer keep that road up. That was a private road, cost him over $5,000, and back then that was a lot of money. So he decided, and see if you've ever heard this term before, my Green Pond friends, he's going to lease some campsites. You all know what that means. And in 1984, leasing of campsites in Green Pond, at least Lake End Corporation, was born. The first phones in the area were Hibernia, and that was 20 years before we found the first documented phone in 1902. And that was only between Merritt's Hotel and Morphy's Tavern, which is the earliest known Lake End hotel. Electricity arrived at Lake End around 1927, and home telephones followed shortly after. Bummer, poor Mr. Morphy. Man, he couldn't get a break. Burned down. So this was less than 10 years old, and in the literature, it describes it, Morphy's Tavern now, up in Green Pond. It's known as Merritt's Hovel, a two-story, miserable shanty. One described Morphy's Tavern as not fit for human occupancy, with chipmunks and red squirrels running all around. Another historian described it as 2 or 3 bunk beds in an old house. Again, small part of that blue-arrowed foundation does still exist on that Lake Denmark property, part of Picatinny. Lake Denmark Hotel number 1 is not on Picatinny and is accessible, but I don't know where it is yet. Someday. And so once this hotel burned down, and I will say that his personal house also burned down, he was pretty much done. So other land holding deals were made, people were selling off, and now we enter in 1899 Mr. Henry Harwood, known as H.H. Isham. He purchases all of the Merritt properties. So this now means that Isham owns Lake End property. He controlled renting campsites, took in income for about 5 years for those surveyed lots. So this was a bargain. Campsites were $35 for the year, but you still had to pay $2 in taxes to Rockaway Township. And of course, there were no services then, no garbage, no police, no nothing. And originally, that rental income was going to be used to maintain that Lake Denmark access road, but somehow that just didn't happen. So Isham put some money into this. He rebuilds Morphy's Tavern Ranch, AKA Lake End Hotel, but he builds now 2 stories with 16 rooms and says that he can accommodate 75 people. My math tells me that's 5 to a room. If you've ever been in those, well, you never were in those rooms. I doubt it. That would be the absolute beginning of the Lake End Hotel as we know it today of being born. So Isham is now looking for some investors, and now Les Shauger, who was only 24 years old, 1907, he acquires a financial interest, but he's still paying to lease that property as well, but somehow there's some kind of a financial interest in there. But Shauger will continue to improve the ranch versus shanty versus hotel, and he wants to make it a decent hotel. In 1913, this newspaper article talks about the now 18-room accommodations. There were 2 dining rooms. This would be, in the middle, the original Lake End Hotel, shown in 1913 from the Lake End side. By 1916, Les is now 35 years old. He buys out all of the other investors and is now the sole owner of the hotel, presumably paying lease money to Mr. Isham. Accommodations got a little more expensive, $12 to $15 a week, not for the year, and none of that money went to reclaim the Denmark Road to Lake End. And it didn't help that the beavers are now raising the water, and if you look at that blue arrow on this slide, it is my belief that that is Les Shauger sitting on the dock. Does everybody see his little man sitting there? I can't imagine that would be anyone else but him. So the Lake End Hotel was known for its many amenities. He had a rowboat fleet as well, and those are pointed out by the blue arrows. So if you look at the top picture of the blue arrows, the backs of the rowboats are just in front of the white lawn chairs. And then we blew that up to the next picture in the middle, and the blue arrow again is showing the back of the rowboats. Why is this so significant? Because everyone that came to Green Pond would rent a rowboat and go in 2 different directions. Lake Enders would go down to Green Pond to get mail and buy milk, and the Green Ponders would come up for the libations that were sold up at the Lake End Hotel. The rowboats lived on. You could rent for 50 cents this popular recreational rowboat. Milk, though, for a time was delivered right to your dock. One little entrepreneur was going around and delivering milk right on people's docks. These photos are a later picture of one of the rowboat fleet purchased by the Keysweater family, who refurbished it, and those are Marion's children in an original refurbished Lake End Hotel rowboat, which I believe she still has. Pre-1921, the Campfire Girls came and camped out what is known today as number 151 and 152 Lake End Road. They would later become Jack Richards' house and Marion Keysweater. And it's very hard to see, but there is a sign there that says Greystone. And the reason the sign is there is that Mr. whoever owned that property, and I think I have a later slide, used to work at Greystone, so he called his camp Camp Greystone. Les Shauger, shown by the red arrow, was a Captain Hook-like figure. He was feared and revered. Reportedly, he ran the Lake End community with an iron fist. His poor little dogs, they said that they quivered all the time because Les used to yell at them all the time. He married Lillian Reinhardt. They had one child, Mildred. She died actually prior to Les Shauger. And there were 2 granddaughters. One of the granddaughters, Mary Elizabeth, or known as Betty Shauger, married Billion. And husband Bill lived at 142 Lake End Road. That cottage still exists in a very natural, Les Shawger days fashion. Very little renovations have been done on. In fact, that house is the most original cottage that we have in our area that I understand. The second grandchild's name is unknown, but Betty lived in Denville, then North Carolina, traveled back and forth, and then she sold her home to Mike and Ellen Blazowski in 2004, and that home still exists. Our folks up on this wonderful picture, this picture came from Ray Goodwin, and we have Bert Zeke, a big family name known, Jack Richards, Les Shawger, and to the far right, Jack Richards Jr. We have not identified the other. That little bridge was built by Shawger and Richards. Those two were thick as thieves. They put that little bridge up over the outlet so they could go on the other side and hunt. Hunting was huge back in those days. In 1916, the Lake End Hotel made it into Field and Stream magazine, telling about the great pickerel, the great bass fishing. Come on up. And then this sign, Lake End Hotel closed. If you look just to the right, very small, it says Route 513. So this sign would have been on the end of Lake End Road, so folks would know that the that the Lake End Hotel was closed. This is a rare photo of the original Lake End Hotel from the street view. So it has had many changes to what that building is today. In 1921, the Lake End campers saw what was going on down in the Green Pond Village. Those campers got together, ponied up a whole lot of money, and bought into the Green Pond Corporation to then rent from the owner down in Green Pond. Lake Enders followed suit. They kind of came together as a unit and allowed one person, pretty much Les Shawger, to speak to Isham to say, listen, we really want to buy this property. Same people were coming back year after year after year to rent these camping site. Shawger was a true visionary. But Mr. Isham was quite clear, no, I'm not selling. However, not too long after he died, his son, Lieutenant Colonel Isham, is now interested in selling. And so on June 20th, 1923, 100 years ago this year, and we celebrated that date, the Lake Enders incorporated for the purpose of purchasing the original Denmark tract. And that included Green Pond and the outlet down to the Picatinny line. The purchase details, there were 7 original incorporators. 6 of them had 2 or 3 shares to total 14, but Les Shawger ponied up 20. And all of them were on the initial board of directors. So our board of directors who are here today, thank you for following in their footsteps 100 years ago. It was a total of 402 acres, and they paid $100,000 for it, which was a very expensive $250 per acre down at Lake End. I'll take 10. They incorporated on June 20th, and the deed was finalized on January 29th, 1924. I might have to have another party in January. And to reduce the heavy mortgage. So although they paid Isham, there was money that was borrowed on behalf of the corporation. In fact, we found what we believe to be that check in the Lake End storage bin. They have a lot of great records. And they decided to lay out the peninsula and lease that property. The result was 83 new lots that were controlled by the Lake End Corporation. And Shawger was a true businessman and leader of the community. I will tell you that the documentation that we saw at the Lake End storage unit was extremely professional. They had businessmen who knew what they were doing. Accountants and lawyers, they knew how to do the whole thing. But Mr. Shawger and Mr. Richards and Mr. Zeke and all the rest of them might have had a little thing for alcohol. I'm not judging, it's just the facts. Prohibition was real, a notable moment in history. However, interestingly, if you were down at the Green Pond Corporation, you could get in your hotel and come up to the lake end during Prohibition and partake. Adult beverages were easily purchased. No alcohol was ever sold in the Green Pond Hotel under the ownership of Julia Dawson because she did not believe in alcohol. So you can see how easy it is to hide alcohol up at Lake End during Prohibition. So how would they get all that alcohol up to the Lake End Hotel? What do you think? How would they do that? How? Thank you. They made it themselves. Of course. What better way to make money than on booze? So make your own. This is a hand-drawn photo of the alleged Jack Richards and Les Shauger still, which ran just fine during Prohibition. Les was actually known for his great wine cellar as well. Patrons came back year after year. That still, alleged, was at Jack Richards' garage, which happened to conveniently be just a few doors down from the Lake End Hotel. And this picture that Gail Richards Doherty drew is really not a true depiction, but I do want to mention, I believe that that's a dog at the top of the slide there, kind of snoozing, and of course the gentleman drinking on his back at the bottom there. But we have put to bed the alleged still because we now have pictures of two of those pieces of that still owned by Gail Richards, and these are planters out in Colorado. So the alleged still is now a planter. Some notables at the Lake End area. Les Shauger, who bought 20 shares for $60,000 worth of stock, formed the Lake End Corporation. Imagine if he didn't do that. One man changed destiny that we all now appreciate. If he hadn't done that, who knows what would have happened to that property? We could have a Marriott down there right now. You don't know. So what would it be like there today? We just don't know, luckily. He was considered the mayor of Lake End, unofficial mayor. He continued to contribute to the development of Lake End when he fixed up the Lake End Hotel. Then he built bungalows. And those bungalows were for the very rich and elite because they had little bungalows to stay in rather than a small hotel room with one little sink and shared bathrooms. The bungalows were actually two rentals in one building. There was one middle chimney that served as a fireplace with two separate quarters photographed here. Those are today's chimneys in one house. We now have one house rather than two, but the fireplace is on both sides. And these exist in several of the homes up in Lake End Corporation today. 145 to 149 Lake End were the original bungalows, and they advertised that heavily, as you can see in the ad on the slide here. The bungalows were advertised as early as 1930. Another important notable is Jack Richards. He was a volunteer member of the Lake End Board, 55 plus years. 55. So you guys, you got some time to put in yet. Tom's shaking his head no. Who does that? 55 years. Of remarkable significance, though, of Jack Richards' legacy, this is another almost loss of the Lake End Corporation, was when the United States Army announced their plans to take eminent domain, 170 acres, between Picatinny Arsenal and including the south part of Lake End Corporation. Why? Quote, to produce a buffer zone from test items and high explosives. If you recall, in 1926, Picatinny Arsenal blew up, bang, and was flattened with all of the ammunition areas of storage, all stored way too close, lightning hit one of them, and the rest, as they say, is history. So they were using that as their reason. Now, mind you, that was 1926, and now this is many, many years later. So, like, why didn't they do it then? Well, we don't think that that's really what they wanted it for. We believe that the unofficial reason, so was the top brass, could come up and enjoy the Green Pond waters. The U.S. Army did not expect the heavy resistance from the Lake End Corporation folks that they got. The fight lasted for 3 years. It included a United States senator, the U.S. Congress, and a New Jersey governor who demanded explanations from the U.S. Army as to why they needed that land. And it even included a trip to Washington, D.C., of which I know Jack Richards, at the very least, was on that trip down there. The final conclusion, Lake End Corporation retains full ownership of that property, but they agreed to a negative easement for the fee of $1 annually not to build or have any human habitation in that land. Thank you, Lake End Corporation, for fighting that. Because, again, if the Army got their hands on it, who knows what that would have been like today. Another notable, Ned Allipers, longtime Lake Ender. He brought Howard Johnson to Green Pond, and Howard came many times. When Howard Johnson heard, and I know the names of the boys, I just can't remember, he heard those two brothers yelling, "Ice cream, ice cream, ice cream for sale." And so Mr. Johnson wrote the song, "I Scream, You Scream, We All Scream for Ice Cream," right there at the Lake End Hotel. He also wrote "When the Moon Comes Over the Mountain" as he watched the moon come over the mountain in Green Pond. And he wrote a poem about his fishing. Ned Allipers autographed it. But Ned's true huge community contribution was said that when he drove his daughter, Peg Phillips, the eventual owner of the Lake End Hotel, and her husband, Ed, he would drive to Sussex with the Phillips in the rumbler seat, thinking that they looked more like a normal, not that they weren't normal, like just a little drive in the country, when they actually were filling up their car with moonshine to get it back to the Lake End Hotel bar. They felt if they got caught, they would look innocent because of the two in the rumbler seat. Am I correct on that, Mrs. Phillips? Thank you very much. She just affirmed that oral history. Thank you very much. So getting to Lake End in the early days meant that you could come by hack on a wagon, come up Lake Denmark Road, but later there were 3 options. You could travel by train. The most common was to come from Dover up the Wharton and Northern, which crossed right in front of the Lake Denmark Hotel that you saw earlier, and they would get off at the Lake End Trail, which, if you recall, was the old Indian trail back in the Indian days. They would walk that trail, which meant they had to hike over that mountain to get into Green Pond. They could have stayed on the train and gone just past Egbert's Lake, which was not there at the time, to the other side of Green Pond Road to the Green Lake train station. How many of you knew there was a train station right there in Green Pond, on Green Pond Road, right by Egbert's Lake? Good. Well, there's a picture of it. And that was the Green Lake train station, well documented. Richard Kimball gave us this photograph. And so anyone who got off there could either trek back to Lake End, or most of them getting off there would trek up the mountain to Green Pond Corporation. The third way in for the Patterson folk is they would come up on the Route 23 tracks that are there today, get off at the Green Pond Junction, which is in the middle of nowhere. It's a ghost town. And they would get on that Wharton and Northern and come down and either get off at this Green Lake train station or come just a little bit further to that Lake End Trail. Don's going to get upset with me. Okay. Poor. Not sure I can find what I'm looking for. So the Lake End Trail from the Wharton and Northern, I'm sorry, this was the slide I was looking for. Can everyone see where it says Lake End Trail? They would just stop that train in the middle of nowhere, which is your picture on the left. And that picture that we are looking at is looking south towards Picatinny and Dover. So that train would come up from the Picatinny area, Lake Denmark area. They would just wave to the train man. He'd let them off. And then the picture on the right is what they had to walk over to get into Green Pond. That trail is somewhat there today, but again, the beavers have really kind of taken that out. This is a short 3/4 to 1 mile mountain straight uphill. Very difficult walk, but they did it all the time. And the Green Lake train station was just on the other side of Green Pond Road. Part of that foundation is still there. We have been to it, but it is on private property, and I do not recommend going over there. But if you can't leave this earth without seeing that foundation, come find me and I'll get you there. Now, you couldn't call Uber. There were no phones back then. So for the first visitors, they all walked. They either walked from the Newfoundland train station on Route 23 up the mountain to get to the Green Pond Corp, or they got to the Lake End Trail, which brought them in that way, or they got off at that Green Lake train station and walked up that. It was walking. That was pretty much what it was. It was walking. Later on, we had some horse-drawn carriages, and after that, Frank White got pretty smart. He had a car to take them directly to the Lake End Hotel, and this form of transportation usually came from the Newfoundland train station. And I love the little picture. It says Lake End, and it says last car, and they just all hung out. They were all over the car coming up that mountain. The Lake End Hotel was heavily publicized for many years. There were several ads in New York newspapers, and we have multiple copies of that. Who says sex doesn't sell? Come on. Green Pond, they invented that. 1939 says Mrs. Shauger is the owner on a 3-mile-long, 1-mile-wide lake. Well, they were only off by a whole lot. And there were cabin and bungalows. So the interesting thing that we have found is, yes, Mrs. Shauger was an owner and a proprietor. So was Nellie Johnson at the Maples. So was Julia Cobb at the Green Pond Hotel. And I thought that rather odd. In an era of male chauvinism, to be blunt, all these women are running the hotels. Someone pointed out to me that the men folk would come every Friday, stay at the hotel with the family, get on a train, and leave their family. So they were very comfortable knowing there was a woman proprietor at a hotel to look after their family. So again, we use that gorgeous photo to get them up into the Lake End area. Shauger advertised it as the best vacation spot. And you know what? It hasn't changed much in the last 100 years. It is as relevant today as it was 100 years ago, although we don't have skeet shooting anymore or tennis. And the blue arrow, I'm sorry, now it's a red arrow, does show the diving platform that used to come over the lake down on the Lake End Corp. Fathers finally pulled that diving board down because of partying, who'd imagine. And we also have those 750 steps, which are not 750 steps, but they were believed to have been built by the power line company when they brought those power lines through. Another activity was kayak, canoe, down to the outlet of what is referred to slang-wise as the dam. Speculation was that the dam was created around 1910 because Shauger wanted the water level of the hike to raise so his rowboats could get in and out easier, and he could dock them at an appropriate height for his docks. The narrow channel made it very easy to put a, I'm going to use that term, dam there again. How many of you have never gone down that outlet to see the dam? You know, you don't know what you're missing. I don't understand, with a dam almost the size of the Hoover Dam, why that is not more of a tourist attraction. It just amazes me. There it is. That is now going to be the proper name, called a mere Weir, thank you, weir. We've been calling it a berm. It is a weir. And Dave Martin gave us those photographs, that photograph, and you have to understand Green Pond. Back in the day, it was wood planks because somebody wanted the water level higher. But somebody else didn't, so they took the planks away. Somebody else wanted it higher, so they put the planks back. Somebody else didn't want it, so they took the planks. Can you imagine in Green Pond? So it is my understanding that Mr. Martin made sure that nobody was taking the concrete out of there. And so there is our new weir that is described as only 2 feet high. They did have tennis courts down there, but they were not built by the hotel. They were built by Mr. Richards. And there is still I think both of them are still there. The blue arrow is showing you the rusted pipe of the tennis net that went across there. Just to give you a little more atmosphere of what it was like down at the Lake End Corporation, you get a glimpse back at the day. There was an ice house, a shed that stored firefighting equipment that was pulled by men, later by horse until the horses all died. And you had a double-seater over there on Laurie Parnew's property. And now I want you to really put yourself in the 1930s. This is what anyone from the other side of the cove was looking at when they looked at the beautiful Lake End Hotel. The beautiful Chris Craft going across the front of that magnificent hotel. And Les Shawger's summer home is shown on the left of that photograph. That was his winter residence at number 142. In the summer, he would move next door. Did I get that right? 143. Yeah, okay, let's start again. His winter residence was at 142. That's the building that still stands today, close to what it looked like then. My numbers are messed up, I'm sorry. This was late when I was doing this. Anyway, 142 became Shawger's granddaughter's house. And this house here has been torn down. Don Gullickson now lives in there. And so Shawger moved back and forth from the 2 houses. Tragically, on October 3rd in 1933, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the hotel, built 28 years prior by H.H. Isham, was destroyed by fire. So we're in October now. There's not many summer residents up there in October, so the origin of that fire, to me, is suspicious, but who am I? A mere 8 months later, it was rebuilt and opened for business again on June 15th. So the photo on the left shows the original Lake End Hotel, and on the right shows the rebuilt Lake End Hotel. Les Shawger operated this hotel from 1907 until 1957. Then what? 1957, he puts it up for sale. Here's Lake End Corporation again at risk, because if someone came in there and wanted to reopen that hotel, that was the normal, everyday event down there. You would have had a hotel down there. Might still be public today. However, after 50 years, the Lake End Hotel doors were closed, Les retired, and luckily it was built by Ed and Peg Phillips, who turned the hotel into a private home. Ed told his wife, "This house needs too much work. We're not buying it." She said, "We're buying it." He said, "Okay, if you call it Father's Folly, then we can buy it." Well, I'm a new-aged American. I don't know what the heck folly means, so I looked it up. The definition of folly is lack of good sense or foolishness. He knew it when he got into it. Less than 20 years later, from when Shawger had rebuilt it, it needed a lot of work. The public was sad. The Lake End residents were ecstatic. And again, we're lucky that was not left open. The 2 Phillip family members still living in Green Pond today is Lou Phillips. You can wave. Lou is still, that's the daughter-in-law. And their grandson, Chris. The Green Pond History Association placed a historic building plaque in front of the hotel, and it was very sad for me because there was no pomp and circumstance because it was during the COVID times. But we did want to mark that hotel as a historic place. And if you go by that picture, please note the rowboat fleet is in the very front of that picture. Stoves were quite the topic at the Lake End Hotel. We have the original stove on the left, then a little bit of a newer stove, and then the really modern new stove. Isn't that a great stove? I know you want one in your house. And don't forget, the 100 summers also meant 100 winters. These are some rare photos that we have of the Lake End Hotel now in the wintertime. Les died in 1971, a year after his daughter, and 11 years after his wife. The unofficial mayor made the newspaper even at that time. Lillian passed in 1960, Les in 1971 at the age of 90. Imagine all that Applejack, and he still lived to be 90. They are buried in the First Presbyterian Church Cemetery on Church Street in Rockaway. Shawgar left behind a legacy of community, family, and a beauty that he shared with his Lake End Hotel. He and the founding fathers can be and should be thanked for what we have today. That's our old hotel on the left and the more modern hotel on the right. We would like to thank members of the Lake End community for donating a substantial amount of money. We did several events this summer, and they did help to finance that. And our research team, this slide presentation was put together by dozens of people looking in newspaper articles, pulling pictures out of their closets. Lou Phillips donated so many for us as well, Ray Goodwin, too many to mention. The Iron Era newspaper, our history book, of course, and several more. I want to thank the Green Pond Executive Board members. If you are here, please stand up. Our current board, stand up. Marilyn Lapham, you're here. Liz is here. Who else? Come on. Cy Callahan is here. Nancy's in the back. Sandy is here. Thank you. Stay standing. If you were ever on my board, please stand up. Linda Thompson, get up. Your name is up there. No, stand up. These are our ex officios. All right. None of what we do could be possible if we didn't have these folks, so we thank you. We are now going to pass a microphone around if anyone has a question. I congratulate Lake End Corp for their 100 years, and I hope I can answer the question. So does anybody have any questions? Yes, there we go. This is me, Mr. Ashworth. He is the current owner of the former Lake End Hotel.
Good evening. I had a question about the original purchase of the Denmark property that was squared off by the government. You know, we talked about the Picatinny having the request for a buffer zone, but somehow they already purchased that property. Was it from Merit or?
So that goes back to an early on slide. What happened was the king went to the Berkeleys, they went to the proprietors, and then Cortland Skinner and John Johnson did the original 4,600 acres, and then those 4,800 acres began to get split up here. And at the very bottom you see Ford, Halloway, Scott, Stickle, Fielder, and the US government started buying that lower area, with Fielder buying the upper area. Fielder rented to Morphy, and the rest is history. Well, yeah. I mean, the proprietors in England, I mean, in the scheme of things here, you know, the King of England was over here in like 1650. So it's only a couple of hundred years. And these tracts have been owned by several people, but for long periods of time, and now Lake End Corporation's owned it for 100. Anybody else? That's good. That means I was clear.
Since we're talking about the Denmark line, that is a property line for several houses at the end of Green Pond Corporation. And it seems that surveyors still have a hard time finding that line. So I'm curious what year the Denmark Square survey was, just to do further research.
So our original Denmark survey was in 1774, but it's well documented in the history book that one of the surveyors later on stood on the east shore, couldn't swear where that Denmark line was over there, so they kind of like picked it there. And that's why dozens of property lines today are under scrutiny for property lines going right through their living room. Several problems with those surveys going back to those days. Anybody else? Did that answer your question? Okay. I thank you all for coming, and happy October. Okay? I hope it was worth the price of admission.